you here. I'm thinking that people will join as we go along. My name is Ken Jones, everyone, and welcome. I'm sitting in Asheville right now, and let me start recording here so we can get all this good stuff recorded. Okay. That should do it. So welcome again. I'm Ken Jones with Reject Raytheon in Asheville. And our organization, let me just tell you a little bit about our organization. We're sponsoring this talk along with Massachusetts Peace Action. And when I finish up here, I'll ask somebody from Massachusetts Peace Action to tell about themselves. So Reject Raytheon is a coalition of started out as organizations, Veterans for Peace and Sunrise Movements, Democratic Socialist of America, and then Party for Socialism and Liberation joined. And what brought us together is that Buncombe County, the county surrounding the city of Asheville, and the state of North Carolina got into a deal with the Raytheon division, Pratt & Whitney, to build a plant here. It happened in secrecy for the most part, was announced, and all of a sudden we were in the position of having to resist it. So for about 5 months now, we've been organized. We have a website, we have social presence, we in Twitter and Instagram, and we show up on the streets at least once every 2 weeks. So we probably have about 20 people in our core group, and we have these teach-ins. We're calling this a teach-in, this webinar that we're doing right now, to help educate ourselves and everyone else about not only Raytheon and Pratt & Whitney and what's happening here in Asheville, but also about the military-industrial complex writ large and so forth. So that's who we are with Reject Raytheon. And so now if someone from our co-sponsor, Mass Peace Action, would jump in and tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Sure, and thank you, Ken. I'm Brian Garvey from up here in Massachusetts, Assistant Director at Massachusetts Peace Action. And just like Reject Raytheon down there in Asheville, we are part of a coalition called the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. And it includes some of the same members that you all have down there, Veterans for Peace, we have the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, United Against War and Militarism, the Friends meetings around here, the wonderful Quaker groups who have been anti-war for so long, the campaign for peace, disarmament, and common security, among many others. We started this campaign just a couple of years ago now, mainly to raise awareness about the ongoing war in Yemen, which has now been going on for 6 years, worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So many people, it seems like this war is on the other side of the world. But to localize that story, we're focusing on Raytheon, which is the military-industrial complex in our own backyard. As I'm sure most of you know, Raytheon's global headquarters is right here in Massachusetts, in the city of Waltham, just a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now. So despite the fact that this war in Yemen's on the other side of the world, so many of the influential decision makers who are driving that war to continue are right here in Massachusetts. So it's a way to let people know that despite the fact that this war is going on the other side of the world, it has a lot to do with major institutions right here in our own backyard. So I'm honored to be with Reject Raytheon right now to work in common cause, to expose Raytheon and what it's doing, and try and take the control back. Thanks, Ken.
All right, thanks, Brian. And so you know, Mass Peace Action is also live streaming this on their Facebook site, and they will take the recording afterwards and put it on their YouTube channel. And in addition, Veterans for Peace National Office is live streaming this as well. So So welcome, Veterans for Peace as well. Let me give you a couple introductions. One is to give us a little set of understandings about how we're going to proceed, and the other is to introduce Christian. So the idea is that Christian will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. Please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question later in the program. And when we get to that segment, one way we can handle this is you can type the word stack into the chat, and we'll keep track and try to call people in order that you put stack in so you can ask questions to Christian afterwards. If we run a little late, Christian said he could run a little late as well. So we try to keep it to an hour, but if it goes a little late and you can stay, he will too. So thanks for that, Christian. Let me give you a quick intro on Christian Sorensen. If you don't know who he is, he's a novelist. He's a military analyst and an independent journalist, mainly focused on war profiteering within the military-industrial complex. He's an Air Force veteran. He's an author of the recently published book, which I read and strongly recommend, called Understanding the War Industry. It's really how I got onto him and asked him to do this. Christian is also a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network, the EMN, an organization of independent veteran military and national security experts. So with that, Christian, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Reject Raytheon Asheville. Thank you, Mass Peace Action. This is a real treat for me. So let me see if I can share my screen. Desktop 1. Open system preferences. One sec here. Can you see my screen yet?
No, we see you, not your screen yet.
Will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit. This is trouble. All right, that's not a problem at all. No, I'm not leaving the meeting. All right, calling an audible. You ready?
You go for it.
Here we go. Share screen. Yes. How about now?
Looks like it's working now.
Oh, giddy up. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. Do you see this? Slideshow.
No, we see a window that says screen recording. Zoom.s would like to record this computer screen. Brian, can you do something with this?
Yeah, I think it's on Christian's end, actually. I think
it's definitely on my end. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I think you just need to open your system preferences and give a permission for it to be able to share.
It says you are sharing screen. This is a real bummer. You know what I can do? We're going to keep going with this, and I'll try again later in the thing. But all right, sorry about that. So thank you all. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I will go from here. So let's get everyone on the same page, because we're all from different backgrounds, and some of us follow these things more closely. So I'll just give a quick review, and then we'll be off and running. So what is the military-industrial-congressional complex? Everyone can see me now, right? This is not no troubles.
You're good.
All right, sweet. The military-industrial congressional complex is an insulated authority. It consists of the U.S. military establishment, which is headquartered in the Pentagon, the war industry, which are the corporations that market and sell goods and services to the U.S. military, to intelligence agencies, and to allied capitalist regimes. The third side of the triangle is Capitol Hill. And Capitol Hill's job is, they're basically the elected representatives. They fund the military, and possibly just as importantly, they pass legislation that abets the permanent warfare state. Profit is the driving force within the MIC. To pull back for a little bit, the US ruling class deploys the military for three reasons: to forcibly open up countries to foreign investment, to ensure the free flow of natural resources out of the global south, primarily into the hands of multinational corporations, and thirdly, and this is what I focus on, because war is big business. The third of these reasons, the profitable nature of war, is what propels the whole complex. The US financial industry sits at the top of the war industry. Investment banks and asset management firms hold most shares in nearly every war corporation, particularly the majors. Now, the major war corporations, the ones that hog the bulk of the contracting, are, and we should all know these, we should all study these, we should all understand these: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and L3Harris. These are the US ones, the main US war corporations. So the US financial industry sits at the top of the war industry in two ways. Number one, as I talked about, they hold the most shares. Number two, they outright own war corporations. Now, this can be seen in, most recently, in a corporation called Amentum, A-M-E-N-T-U-M. It's brand new as of only a few months ago. Lindsay Goldberg is a private equity firm. Lindsay Goldberg created Amentum, and then soon thereafter, Amentum gobbled up DynCorp. Now you know DynCorp from its mercenary activities. So now already Amentum is one of it's a top maybe 25 war corporation. It's absolutely nothing to sneeze at, and it's very, very, very harmful. So they either own the majority of the shares of a war corporation, or they outright own the war corporation. And over time, they wheel and deal these corporations: private equity, Wall Street, financial firms. They wheel and deal them. It's just it's a means to make money. The only notable exception to the owning most of the shares of a war corporation is two corporations: Sierra Nevada Corporation and General Atomics. Both of those are just private. They're privately held. And we can get into that a little more if you want, into what they do. But yeah. So those in corporate suites, whether the headquarters of a war corporation, many of which are located in Northern Virginia, or in Raytheon's case in Waltham, Massachusetts, or whether you're in a corporate suite on Wall Street, see the troops as numbers. The troops are just numbers. They are vessels for corporate goods and services. And the bases that the troops inhabit, whether here in the United States or abroad, are avenues through which to route corporate goods and services. You know, we have hundreds of bases in the United States, as you know, hundreds more abroad. One of the reasons why we have all these bases is because there's so much profit that you can route through or accrue through just one base abroad. So in just one base, you can have fixed wing aircraft, whether it's a fighter jet or cargo plane or refueling aircraft, multiple in many cases, helicopters, maintenance. Now, these are war corporations that produce all of this: maintenance, large drones, small drones, force protection measures, which are anything that keeps the base safe, ordnance, O-R-D-N-A-N-C-E, basically anything that explodes, you know, artillery, bombs, missiles. Corporations produce all that. Communications infrastructure, intelligence, communications gear, radar, land vehicles, base operations. Back in the day, before the Pentagon's full embrace of neoliberal economic policies, the troops ran the bases. If you need, pest control, the troops did that. If you needed the pavement touched up, or if you needed, in some bases up north, the pavement plowed, the troops did that. If you need the trash taken out, the troops did that. Not anymore. Increasingly, at many bases, more and more, a corporation carries this out. It's called Base Operations Support Services, or BOSS. Construction, transportation, information technology, satellite technology, fuel, all of this can be routed and is routed through just one base. So multiply that by all of the bases overseas, and you get a little understanding of why we are always at war. Capital. Capital is money that is used to expand business in order to make more profit. Capital traditionally involves what you see in Asheville, where a corporation builds new factories to produce more goods from which to profit. To make more and more money, more and more parts of life must be pulled into capital to be exchanged for money. Therefore, you see in civilian life, everything is commodified these days. Land, food, housing, water. It doesn't matter that these are necessities. It doesn't matter that they should be human rights. They are increasingly all commodified. And this is why you see corporations taking over many military functions. And as you know, a given corporation now in charge of what was once a governmental task needs to get a layer of profit out of it. And so what do? They either end up charging more, cutting jobs, reducing, trying to go after labor and union rights, reduce labor protections, pollute. This is how corporations and war corporations make all their, make a significant amount of bank. And I was really, really excited watching your March teach-in. You at Reject Raytheon Asheville had a great teach-in in March, and you explained this. You gave concrete examples of how Raytheon does this. And that was pretty awesome. And so I was really, really excited to see that. So let me try once more, if you don't mind, sharing my screen. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Share screen. Do you see a slideshow?
Yeah, says military presence in North Carolina.
My man. All right, awesome. We're back in business. Here we go. So this is a map of North Carolina, and the main base, these are just the military bases, the military facilities there. The main ones, as you know, Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune is a big one, and Dare Range over on the East Coast. You can see it's up near the Outer Banks. Dare Range, I point out and I highlight just real quickly, it's a training range, a bombing range, where they pilots practice strafing and bombing targets. And it's important to note that as we move forward and as we create a new and better society, these ranges, when the people eventually take charge of policy and the policy coming out of Washington, D.C. or our local governments reflects the needs and wants of the people, these ranges are prime opportunity for rewilding. Leave them alone, let nature take its course, no humans allowed. And the good thing is these ranges, if there's a silver lining, these ranges are all over the place. They're all over the United States. So we leave them alone, and it's just something to think about, something to chew on. Can you see the bottom of what do you see at the bottom of the screen? Can you see contract awards performed, all that?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So this slide is from North Carolina. This slide is about North Carolina, is from the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation in the Pentagon. Now, if you see at the top of the screen, 3 in, it says 2.2% of total US defense spending goes into North Carolina. Now, I look at that as although it's a large sum of money, it is good for North Carolina insofar as you are not one of these states that is really, really tied to the war industry, okay? You do have Pentagon money coming into your state. You do have sizable military presence, which we talked about, but the war industry is not fully up in North Carolina. If you look at the states that really have a huge, overwhelming, just dominant presence, you'll see Virginia, you'll see Maryland, you'll see California, particularly Southern California, you'll see Texas. And then there's after the top maybe 7 or 8, there's a huge drop off. And so if you look at where it says top defense contractors over on the right, I just want to run down these real quick. Again, there's good news here. You see General Dynamics and you see khaki. Those are some real players. They're tough. They are cutthroat. They are really, really brutal war corporations. But everyone else on the list, there's reason to be excited here. And I'll explain why. So Environmental Chemical Corps does environmental remediation, and it does some construction. So it's not inherently a war corporation. Quantico Tactical outfits with gear. It outfits the troops with gear. It does, but it's not exclusively a war corporation either. It does contracting with police departments, with other portions of the federal government. So there's some room to breathe there. BWX Technologies works with all things nuclear. It co-runs some of the nuclear labs. It works on naval nuclear propulsion, but that can also have civilian applications. General Dynamics and khaki we talked about. Sodexo provides food. Some of the contractors that are not war corporations, some of the contractors that show up regularly on the Pentagon's public contract announcements that I study are these giant food conglomerates, US Foods, Sodexo. So Sodexo, again, not inherently a war corporation. It goes to it contracts with the Pentagon because it knows where the money is, but that doesn't make it inherently a bad corporation. So keep these notes in mind when we build a better future, when we transition and try to transition from a war industry to an industry that cares for human needs and needs of the natural world. Just run down the list real quick. ACC Construction does construction. Again, not inherently military. KDH does body armor. Aptim Federal Services Construction. Sauer does construction. So the North Carolina community can study this and understand that they're up against some beasts, General Dynamics and khaki, but the war industry has yet to really entrench. And this is according to the Pentagon's own data. So let me see if I can, nice. War industry in North Carolina. I did a little research, and this is not an exhaustive study, but I tried to go over the past 9 months of contracting and see what is happening in North Carolina with respect to the war industry. So this is intended to complement the Pentagon's slide that I just showed you. So where the trash cans are where the war industry is based on those contracts that I reviewed. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see the town names where there is minor war industry activity going on. I'll let you look at the slide for a little bit. All right. The underlined portions are the goods and services sold. The bold portion is the town or the region where the war industry work is taking place. So we review these really quickly, and then I'll explain a little bit more as to why I am actually optimistic here. You have artificial intelligence in the Raleigh-Durham area, aircraft countermeasures, which are basically devices to prevent an incoming missile from harming the aircraft. You have training. You have some work on drones in the Morrisville area, and you have Research Triangle Park in Durham, between Durham and Cary. I mentioned Research Triangle Park because it used to show up a lot in the Pentagon's contracts, and not so much these days. Now, I don't know why that is. It could have to do with maybe classification. It could have to do with the contracting amount. The Pentagon is required to list in its public contract announcements any contracting valued at over $7 million. So if maybe the work there is below the 7 million threshold, I don't know. Raleigh-Durham, more here. You have work on engine parts. You have Duke University doing some work on neurotechnology. Think about Neuralink, that type of, at least somewhat pie in the sky, but it does have some military applications if they can get it functioning. You have chemiluminescence in Durham as well. That's basically chem lights. You have Raytheon doing a little bit of algorithm work for aircraft tracking and sensors in Durham as well. Wake Forest, you have United Electronics, which is from Braintree, Massachusetts, working on some radar. And you have in Wilson some fire protection systems for the F-35. Now, maybe there's a peace group out there that you can reach out to, because you in Asheville are fighting peacefully against a war corporation that is dealing with that is producing a good or a service for the F-35. And now in Wilson, you have comrades over there, because they're also have somebody or some corporation working on a part of the F-35 as well. I'll speed up this just a little bit, just so we can make sure I stay on time, and I can always go back to these during question and answer. Greensboro works a little bit on microelectronics, which again, civilian application there. Greensboro works on air transport. General Dynamics has a decent presence in McLeansville. It works on underwater activity, so submarines, underwater drones, that kind of thing. Reidsville makes a modular fuel system for the Army, a war corporation in Reidsville, that is, and Reidsville is northeast of Greensboro. And in Welcome, you have information technology. Fayetteville, as you know, is home to Fort Bragg. You can look at this slide. I won't do much talking here, but there's training, there's some logistics, there is curricula, and a little bit of IT work. So what's going on in Nashville? We know from your March teach-in and your extensive work reaching out and showing how Raytheon, the Pratt & Whitney brand that it has, or division rather, is working on engines for F-35 aircraft. But what else is going on? There's Black Mountain, which there is Raytheon as well, working on radar for a Boeing aircraft there. There's another corporation in Black Mountain as well, working on a part for a Lockheed Martin helicopter. And in Weaverville, there's IT services. So there's some other activity going on in and around Asheville. Some of this could be subcontracting, but I believe it's mostly done by the corporations that are listed here. What's going on the coast? Boeing, some tilt rotor aircraft work there. In Havelock, there is some logistics, and there is a corporation based out of Wilmington that is selling training and sundry related administrative activities to Special Operations Command down in Tampa. So what else is going on? There are other parts, or there are other businesses in North Carolina, not traditionally considered part of the war industry, that aid the US military. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but let's get into how this applies to North Carolina businesses. Clothing and light gear. Burlington Industries sells cloth to the Navy. Okay. Creighton in Reidsville makes trousers for the Navy. All right. Federal Prison Industries, doing business as Unicor, this is important to highlight, makes clothing, and it makes light gear for the US military. Federal Prison Industries functions as sort of a government-run corporation. And I bring it up because you can, and we should, and many have, reach out to allies who are working to end what many call the prison industrial complex. Because under the 13th Amendment, it's fairly legal, fairly is not the right word, it is legal, unfairly legal, to use prison labor to produce goods at a cheap price. So the people in the prisons get paid a pittance to make goods and services, clothing and light gear for the military. And that needs to be remedied as well as we build a new society. Construction. There's ongoing construction at US military bases in North Carolina and throughout the United States. Construction is one of the most common types of contracts that I see when I study the Pentagon's daily contract announcements. Sometimes construction at military bases in North Carolina is carried out by North Carolina construction firms. sometimes it's carried out by firms outside of North Carolina. Here at the bottom, I list some of the firms within North Carolina that carry out construction for the US military on a semi or regular basis. That is carrying out the construction. So those workers feel like they are part of the team. They feel, good, like they're quote unquote supporting the troops. And that's a very powerful narcotic. And we must keep that in mind as we study things and as we share our experiences and as we educate one another. We must get closer to the workers who do this stuff and understand their perspective and try to move forward together. Construction is even more pernicious because it physically lays the groundwork for the permanent warfare state. Every ops squadron that is built, every silo that's built, every hangar that's built, every intel building that is built, every skiff, whatever, it extends the permanent warfare state, and it basically kicks the can down the road because it's one more thing that we have to tackle, and that's one more problem. Just make sure. Okay, good. So we have construction, we have education. There are a few community colleges, trade schools in North Carolina that educate the military. There was a huge contract for Navy enlisted education recently, back in July of 2020. And a few of them popped up on that contract. Food, again, there are corporations that specialize in food. And there are branches of those corporations in North Carolina that sell to the US military. Energy. Duke Energy sells energy conservation measures for bases in North Carolina. Now, mostly this involves retrofitting existing bases, existing installations on the base, and installing energy management control systems. These are marketed as providing sustainable infrastructure, but there's no emphasis placed on the troops reducing their energy use. They don't bring the troops home. They don't slow down the training. They don't slow down the polluting activities. It's just business as usual, but with a green face. Keep in mind, as I'm sure many of you know, the US military is the single largest institutional polluter in the world. It is not just carbon, although that's a huge problem. It is particulates, radioactive waste, PFAS, which are forever chemicals that cause cancer and other diseases. They're used often in the foams that the US military uses to put out aircraft fires. The war industry uses them in some manufacturing as well, burn pits, etc. So I bring up Duke Energy not just because it's in Raleigh, somewhat regularly in Pentagon contracts, but because it is part of the greening of the military, so-called greening, which perpetuates militarism by giving it a friendly face. You cannot green a global array of military installations whose primary purpose, aside from profiting the war industry, is to oversee resource extraction, including fossil fuel, from the global south into the hands of multinational corporations. There's nothing green about that, and there never will be. It's a great PR move. It looks great on officers' performance reports. It looks great, the Pentagon press secretary gets up and says stuff like that, but there's nothing green about it. And to make matters even worse, according to the Institute on Taxation and Corporate Policy, Duke Energy, quote, paid no corporate taxes on the $7.9 billion that it made in profit over the last 3 years. And that study came out, I think, this year. So it's a double whammy. They're not even paying their fair share as they are helping to, green the world's most destructive force. Base operations support services, we talked about this earlier, work once done by the troops that keep the base running. There are these corporations in North Carolina that provide this service or sell this service. So what's good about this? Why am I optimistic? The good news is that most of these North Carolina companies that currently work to support war pose no dilemma when converting the war industry to industry that meets the needs of humans and the natural world. They are not inherently invested in war. We all need transport, IT, clothing, construction, education, radar, logistics, food, energy. So with the right pressure from above and a mass groundswell from below, we can convert these corporations and actual war corporations from a war focus to a human and environmental focus. We can do this. We can do anything. So I will do one more deck of slides. And then sharing is paused. Hello. We will share again. Resume share. All right. Screen sharing again. Giddy up. Sweet. All right. So what is Raytheon's reach? We gave an overview of the military-industrial-congressional complex. We talked about what's going on, the war industry in North Carolina. And you've asked me to discuss Raytheon's reach in broad strokes. In your March teach-in, and if anybody who's listening right now or watching right now has not seen Reject Raytheon Asheville's March teach-in, it is available on their website. I highly encourage you to go watch it. It is filled with incredibly valuable information. They know what they're doing. They're a great organization. And so what I will present today is intended to complement them, not to cover a lot of the same territory. So Raytheon's reach, what's it up to? Cooperation. War corporations nominally compete. If there's a big contract out there, the big six will bid on it, no problems. But the big six war corporations, they function more like a cartel. And just to review, and we all need to know these names, the big six are Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and L3Harris. These are the big six US war corporations. They're all in it together and they all cooperate. Platforms are any major moving vehicle. If it's in the air, if it's on the land, if it's on the sea, if it's under the sea, it's a platform. Most people, you and I, when we see an aircraft, we see that, we just see an aircraft. We see a ship, we see a vehicle. War corporations see a platform upon which to place or through which to route goods and services. The General Atomics MQ-9 drone. If there is a drone strike, a US drone strike in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, maybe even the Philippines, there were some news reports about US drones circling the Philippines as recently as last year and the year before. It is likely carried out by this drone, the General Atomics MQ-9, or a slight variation of this drone. It is a General Atomics product, yes, but many corporations produce goods and services for Lockheed Martin division. They make the bombs and the missiles. L3Harris makes the training system and maintains the craft. And Raytheon produces the targeting sensor and the radar warning receiver. This is just one example of how corporations cooperate on most platforms. So please keep this in mind. All right. So I bring this up because Raytheon does this a lot. It does it on the General Atomics drone we just talked about, but just a few other examples. There's a Raytheon plant in McKinney, Texas, that develops targeting pods that go on the underside of a Boeing fighter aircraft. The same plant makes television cameras and sensors for the Bradley fighting vehicle, which is a BAE Systems product. BAE Systems is the premier war corporation of the United Kingdom. It is based in London. It is actually based in London, a stone's throw from Whitehall, from the seat of British government.
The presenter they got is pretty good.
Yes.
Please, if you don't mind muting, because I'm hearing people. I don't want to be a jerk, but I'm getting feedback. So please mute while I'm almost done. I promise I'm almost done. So yes, I bring this up because Raytheon cooperates with all the other major war corporations as well. Business sectors of war. These are military functions that corporations now run. Corporations now are in charge of these. Troops used to carry out many of these tasks, but now you have war corporations carrying them out. And most large war corporations, and even some medium-sized ones, specialize in multiple business sectors of war. I'll let you read these. These are examples of business sectors of war. Everything from propaganda and public. I would like to highlight a few. Mercenaries, about halfway down, mercenaries and or personnel with active government clearances. Personnel with active government clearances are like currency for these war corporations. When they're pitching products and when they are bidding on contracts with the Pentagon, they say, hey, you know, our so-and-so division has 1,300 cleared personnel with government clearance. And they'll usually say, oh, top secret, SCI, TSSCI, or some level. This is, in this way, in this manner, war corporations often function as what's known as body shops. They basically hoard cleared personnel and use them to carry out the tasks of the war corporation. And it's the clearance itself is very valuable, not just for the mercenary, but for the war corporation when engaging in contracting with the government. Mercenaries are not just people who pick up a weapon, work for a war corporation, and are deployed overseas. It's anybody who is working for a war corporation and is getting, is a civilian functionally, and is getting higher salary than their uniformed peers. If you go about maybe 2/3 of the way down, you'll see space. Space, of all of the business sectors of war, space is arguably the most corporatized. Everything from the ranges where the military launches satellites, Florida and in California, to the actual launch vehicles, to the actual satellites, to the ground monitoring of those satellites. All these activities are carried out by corporations. It's one of the reasons why I've documented that there's so much pressure on establishing Space Force. It was just one more step toward the corporatization of more and more military activity. And I'm not saying that that was the defining moment, but it allowed greater corporate reach into the space business sector of war. Raytheon's involved in all of those steps that I just mentioned. It tag teams with, I believe it's General Dynamics, to create a corporation called RG Next, Range Generation Next, and it runs the ranges in Florida on the East Coast and at Vandenberg Air Force Base, sort of technically Southern California on the West Coast. And then you have intelligence. Intelligence, it was once sacrilege, almost anathema, for a corporation to carry out intelligence activities within any military intelligence or civilian intelligence agency in the US government. And that was pretty much true until maybe the early 90s, late 80s. But now corporations carry out certainly more than half, a plurality, let's say, of government intelligence activity. And that's reasons. But it's the profit motive shouldn't be in any of these business sectors of war, obviously. And the troops or civilian intelligence personnel should be carrying out this stuff. But when you inject the profit motive into any of these business sectors, but particularly intelligence, there's an inherent need to find more enemies and to fabricate enemies where none exist. And I've talked to it's pretty bad. Some Raytheon's business sectors of war. Just go over this really quickly. Raytheon does everything. It does everything. It has every single business sector of war. It contracts and sells goods and services, rather, for all the business sectors. The only thing Raytheon doesn't really do is build large aircraft. You have Boeing and Lockheed Martin, which build the remaining fighter aircraft. Raytheon doesn't build a tanker, a refueling aircraft either. Doesn't do, it has some drone capabilities, but it does basically everything else. So you can see on the screen, I'll highlight the nuclear weaponry, the Global Aircrew Strategic Network Terminal, because this comes up every few years in Pentagon contracting, and it came up twice in 2020. It is the command and control system for U.S. Air Force nuclear armed bombers. And, we have to get rid of nuclear weapons one way or another. This is, and there's profit, there's profit. So there's reason why, well, we'll get to the reason why they hype all these, bad guys overseas or whatever. Let me just continue with intelligence real quick. You see at the bottom, these are the major corporations that fill out the IT-heavy intelligence organizations. And you can read them right there. SAIC is a big one. Bose Allen Hamilton, you're familiar with. Carasoft is not too famous, but in recent years, it's really come on strong. I say IT-heavy because most intelligence activity has to do with computers. It has to do with information technology these days. Forget whatever you've seen in, of cloak and dagger, Hollywood stuff. Most of the U.S. intelligence, not just budget, but activity is just based on computers, based with computers. Insofar as U.S. intelligence is decent at anything, it is because of two factors. Number one, they have nearly unlimited funding. And two, they have the best technology right now. Those are the two things that U.S. intelligence has going for it. And in the intelligence game, you have the funding and you have the technology, you're top dog. Locations. This is where Raytheon has major plants, major facilities in the United States. You see a lot of big cluster up in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Massachusetts has multiple locations. Waltham is, yes, it's the headquarters, but it never shows up in Pentagon contracting. And that is because nothing's produced there. It's just where the suits gather and, scheme and do what suits do. You see a lot of stars near our nation's capital. That's because it's where the influence is peddled. That's where a lot of war corporations have their headquarters. And if they don't have headquarters there, they have a ton of offices. The corridor between Northern Virginia, or that runs from Northern Virginia through the nation's capital, through up until Baltimore, is just rife with war corporations. They obviously pitch to the Pentagon and all of the various subdivisions within the overall U.S. Department of War. They pitch, if you ever drive by in and around NSA and Fort Meade, you'll just see sign after sign for a war corporation. There are a lot of business parks in and around there as well. They go where the money is. Southern California, you can see that there as well. Here are some examples of what Raytheon does, where the locations are. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the question and answer session. You see it's spread out fairly well across the country. Any war corporation that has a presence in Colorado usually has to do with space. The space sector is based in Colorado and based in Southern California, out of Los Angeles Air Force Base. And then you have obviously a presence for military activity. The corporations carrying out military activity in the launch places in Cape Canaveral on the East Coast, and Patrick Air Force Base on the East Coast in Florida, and as we talked about, Vandenberg Air Force Base. All right, last couple slides, I'll end with this. War corporations, like any multinational corporations, have no loyalty to the US, none whatsoever. They are loyal to currency, period. The US war industry sells to capitalist regimes around, and foreign military sales, FMS. FMS tend to deal with big ticket items or goods and services of a sensitive nature. Through FMS, the US government procures and transfers industry goods and services to allied governments. DSCA, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, is the intermediary between the US war industry and the FMS customers overseas. The Leahy Law is intended to prevent US military assistance from reaching militaries that have committed serious human rights violations. It is almost never enforced when it comes to sales to allied capitalist regimes. They just ignore it. US ignores it. Recipient nation ignores it. No problem. The Arms Export Control Act requires recipients of US war industry goods and services to use them only in self-defense. So customers of the US war industry just say, hey, we're using these in self-defense. And the US government says, all right, use them in self-defense. Good to go. That's the game. It's horrible. It's criminal. In fiscal year 2020 alone, the war industry sold $50.8 billion through foreign military sales and roughly $124 billion through direct commercial sales. Just to give you an idea of the size of this monster. And yeah, I mean, we're all there's a reason the U.S. stirs up trouble around the world. These sales, you have to justify the sales. You know, China versus Japan, North Korea versus South, China versus the civilized Western world. Russia, the big Russian bear versus Eastern Europe. All this, the war on drugs, the war on terror, great power competition. The excuses are endless. And one of the reasons for having all these conflicts is to sell the weapons. It's one of the major reasons. Raytheon, as you can see, has offices overseas to facilitate these sales. In the UK, in Riyadh, and saw you're in the UAE capital. Just to end here, some recent Raytheon foreign military sales. You can see Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, just a variety of goods and services. Iran is one of the big bad guys these days, one of the official enemies. So you can then sell goods and services to all of the Gulf absolutist regimes, Arab absolutist regimes, essentially they're kleptocracies. And you can see some of those here. At the bottom, please note that in February 2020, Raytheon, which works with Lockheed Martin to produce an anti-tank weapon called Javelin, sold ongoing work on Javelin to these governments: Australia, Czech Republic, Estonia, France, Georgia, all the way through Ukraine and the UAE. And I bring this up because, not just because Raytheon's involved, but because these types of contracts are fairly common. You will see nations bundled together on a major contract. And the War Corporation will pitch it to the Pentagon by saying, hey, if you sell to all these countries, then there's economies of scale. The system will cost less to you. Now, that's hardly ever verifiable, but it helps sell the goods and services. So I'll leave it here, and I will pause here, and then I will conclude. I have maybe a 5-minute conclusion after the question and answer period. So thank you for your time. I hope I didn't go too long, and sorry for the ramble sometimes.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Christian. And how about if we designate maybe 15 minutes, if that sounds okay, for questions and answers. And what we might do is, if you would type the word stack, S-T-A-C-K, just like I did right there in the chat, then what we'll do is take them in order as people have questions, and I'll call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So who has a question? All right, Chris Berg, go ahead, unmute yourself, Chris.
Hi, Christian. I was wondering, I've done a little tracing of arms trade kinds of deals, but I wasn't familiar with the Defense Foreign Sales Unit you mentioned. Do they do annual reports or that sort of thing, or useful stuff?
You're referring to for DSCA?
Yes.
Yeah, their website is actually fairly comprehensive, and they're fairly honest about their role. They will even say, for example, the recent general, his name was Charles Hooper, I believe, Hooper. He was a very affable gentleman. He would show up at the think tanks and he would explain the nature of his unit. He was a lieutenant general, and he was very honest. He'd say, arms sales, weapon sales are policy. There's a very educational interview that he did with the Brookings Institute on, I believe it was June of 2019, if memory serves me correctly. But you can find him by searching DuckDuckGo, Charles Hooper, Brookings Institution or Brookings Institute. And yeah, to answer your question briefly, their website is it's fairly comprehensive. And the reason is because when you deal with foreign military sales, you have to notify Congress. So they'll notify Congress first, and then Congress will usually just rubber stamp, knee-jerk approval, but they have to then, it's a sort of a back and forth. And if Congress has any objections, then DSCA has to sort of tweak it. And like I said, DSCA is the intermediary between the war corporation and the recipient customer overseas. And DSCA, I believe, obviously it has to work with the State Department, but I believe it takes a little cut, a little slice. It's like 3% or something like that off the deal. And then the government gets that. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul, you're up next.
Well, thanks very much, Christian. That was incredibly informative. I'm just wondering, did you do that breakdown for North Carolina because of tonight's webinar, or do you have breakdowns like that for other states?
No, absolutely. I can do other states. I prepared this specifically for North Carolina because I thought it would be informative for the group. But yeah, I can. I just have to. It doesn't take a ton of time because I have just kept detailed notes on this stuff for the last 7 years. So I just have to go into my files, and it's more of a formatting thing. So yeah, I can do it to other states or for other states if you're interested, and I'd be happy to speak if you have a peace group wherever you are.
Yeah, we're in Massachusetts. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
That'd be great, especially this incredible information you have about Raytheon, because we're not aware of a lot of that information of different services that Raytheon is involved in and where. If you could just, one last question, if I could sneak it in, to just distinguish between the two different ways that foreign military sales are made. The FMS process goes through the Pentagon. They arrange the contract. Is that what happens? Is there really any difference between Raytheon or these companies selling directly through commercial sales and the FMS process?
Good question. So let me clarify. So yeah, there is a difference. One of the trends in recent years, particularly actually oddly, maybe not oddly enough, particularly under the Trump administration, was trying to push more foreign military sales into direct commercial sales. And the reason they do that is because it's easier. There's less paperwork. Foreign military sales typically have to do with the really big ticket items or the items of sensitive technology. So there's more paperwork, there's a little more back and forth. There are various bureaucracies within the Pentagon that have to sort of get involved and sign off on things. So the more you can push foreign military sales into direct commercial sales, then the corporation itself can just say, hey, we can sell directly to the Allied capitalist regime overseas, no problem. And if you look at the breakdown, Defense News, actually, there's a good journalist who works for Defense News. His name is Aaron Mehta, Mehta. And he sort of after the end of every fiscal year, he goes through the breakdown of how sort of how many billions in sales go through FMS and how many billions go through direct commercial sales. And you'll see over time that at least the last 3 years that it's sort of gone like this. So they've just tried to get less from FMS, pushed more into direct commercial sales. It just smooths the process, and there's just less paperwork. And yeah, just big business.
Are those commercial sales supposed to be guided by the Leahy bill, the Leahy amendment, and all those
Absolutely.
things?
Yeah. Any arms transfers. It's not just FMS that's supposed to cover, but yeah, anything that any war corporation from the U.S., whether it goes through the federal government through DSCA via the FMS process, or whether it's selling directly through direct commercial sales, has to abide by those two statutes. They don't, and the government looks the other way. But yeah, they're supposed to.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I've got Rachel next on stack. Unmute yourself, Rachel. You still there, Rachel?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you address a little bit about the relationship between local governments and these corporations such as Raytheon? I mean, in North Carolina, we had the Chamber of Commerce involved, the economic development people, the governor, our county commission, which gave 27 million in incentives, a nonprofit foundation, Duke Energy. They all worked together as technical college. And we were overwhelmed with all these people working together. And they had a non-disclosure agreement that the public had no awareness of any of this going on. Is this pretty normal?
So I am not an expert in that area whatsoever. I know my limits, and I don't believe I'm qualified to answer that. But I will say, just in studying the nature of the capitalist beast, is that the decisions are typically made behind closed doors, and then when they have to declare it to the public, it's more of a formality. And this doesn't just apply to the U.S. war industry, obviously, but it's just the nature of big business and how it is able to capture government. And unfortunately, and this is a blanket statement. This is not true for everyone, and I'm not trying to paint everyone with the same brush. But unfortunately, the type of characters that are drawn to various levels of government, whether it's federal, state, or local, are not always the most. They can be unsavory characters. They're in it for their own personal and professional advancement, and they're in it for. They're not in it necessarily to serve the people. And so you have it's a real witch's brew of bad actors, to use a State Department term. These are bad actors, and they get together and they make the deals. And I'm really glad actually you brought up NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, because that's their secret sauce. They say, all right, well, we will schmooze, and then we will all sign these NDAs, and then we can't talk about it, and hey, sorry. And secrecy is really it's sort of the chainmail for the whole thing. It's the tie that binds the whole thing. And it's not just when it comes to business activities. It is also when it comes to the overall military-industrial congressional complex as a whole. They classify information, whether it's just from an NDA or confidential, secret, top secret, in order to keep the public ignorant of government criminality, just in general, or the scope of the surveillance state, or the full cost of war, or fraud, waste, and abuse. They use secrecy as their armor, and it prevents the public from acting and truly understanding the nature of the beast and the entrenched militarism. So yeah, great question. And sorry, I don't know much about local government with respect to war corporations.
Fahim is next.
Hi, Christian. Thanks for the presentation. So my question is similar to what Rachel, I guess, mentioned, but I'm more interested in finding out in your research, what is the role of local universities in North Carolina when it comes to collaborating with Raytheon or the Big Six in providing not only intellectual and technical expertise, but also from a funding perspective, like if they have their I know University of Texas, where I went to, they a lot of their mutual fund is heavily invested in the war industry. And in their case, I mean, it's a totally different animal because they have got the Army Futures Command there also. So, but either way, so I just wanted to find out of how much the local universities are embedded with the war machine.
Great question. Great question. So there's a couple of ways to answer this. Wake Forest doesn't show up a lot. NC State doesn't really show up a lot. Duke doesn't really show up a lot. None of the major institutions show up a lot in the Pentagon's contracts. And that doesn't mean that there's not work being done. And it doesn't mean there could be, the work could be classified. It could be done through, it could not meet the $7 million threshold that we talked about earlier, above which the Pentagon needs to disclose most of these activities. I don't see a lot of North Carolina universities showing up on the Pentagon's contracts. However, I can almost guarantee that like you mentioned, their endowments are invested heavily in the war machine, and that would be up to local journalists or national journalists to try to solicit. Whether they go through, they'd have to work with the institutions or find whistleblowers or try if it's a.
Well, in the case of, if you don't mind me interrupting,
state. Say again?
No, I was saying in the case
No,
of
please.
University of Texas, there was a FOIA request done by the folks at CodePaint.
Exactly.
And basically we could see of how much was invested with which company and so on and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. So FOIA is an excellent tool if it is not a private university. And then I would also add that Research Triangle Park is a huge player. There's a lot of contracting there, but there's opacity there because there is a sort of a public-private flavor to it, and there's just one more level of cloudiness because Research Triangle Park, you have local universities going there to do some of the research, but then you also have independent corporations working at Research Triangle Park that recruit from the local universities. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just sort of give a brief overview of academia's role within the war industry, because academia is part of the industry. It's part of the war industry. It's not its separate thing. It doesn't need its own, letter within the overall initialism. It's part of the war industry. And you have these universities that, so academia plays basically a few roles. You have the main role, which is, as we talked about, research and development of technology. The other role that universities and institutes of higher education perform is they're basically a holding station. You'll see MIC elites, you'll see revolving door characters show up at Harvard's Belfer Center or Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab as senior fellows. And the senior fellows sort of guide the research. They don't do the actual research, but they suggest, and they serve more as almost like functionaries on the board, basically, functionarily. And then the other role would be accepting philanthropy. These academic institutions accept philanthropy from the war profiteers, and that has the function of whitewashing their brutality, their capitalist brutality. So you'll see MIT got in trouble recently, but they shook it off and they just they ignored the public opinion and they kept going. They took money from a very wealthy man who donated to, I believe it was MIT's Media Lab. And he was involved in a lot of bad activity, not necessarily in the war machine, but I believe he was a private equity character, and he was involved in heavy lobbying California against a bill and he won. And the bill would have provided more rights for people who are looking for equitable housing and fair, less commodification of the housing market. And so that's just one example. You see actually another philanthropist, quote unquote, a capitalist of significant brutality. His name is Dave Rubinstein, and he is involved in the Carlyle Group, and he has his name on a building up at Harvard. And he, so this is the third way that academia operates within the war industry. The main one is research and development and technology that usually goes to military or intelligence or military intelligence. The second is holding station for MIC elites. And the third is whitewashing war profiteers. And you can see that University of Texas, you can see that a lot, but the main players in this game are MIT, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, Stanford University, University of Dayton, which is near the Air Force Research Lab, and Georgia Tech shows up a lot. So thanks, that was a great question.
Thank you.
Okay, we have on the chat 4 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 more questions, and after that we'll call quits on the questions and give Christian a break.
No, it's good.
Okay, you're doing great. So the next person is Kristen. If you would unmute yourself and go ahead, Kristen.
Hey, thanks for sharing your time and knowledge tonight. My question may be similar to Rachel's, where it's not your area of expertise, but as you've been following the industry and these players, have you seen any examples of community initiatives like Reject Raytheon that have successfully ousted these behemoths? And if so, please share their info. And if not, can you tell us a little bit more about why you described yourself earlier as hopeful?
So I will stay in communication with Ken and Brian, and if I can come up with a successful, an example of successful pushback against the war industry on the local level, I will share that with him. I can't think of anything at the top of my off the top of my head, but I will say that yes, I am indeed optimistic. And I will share the reasons why in my conclusion. I want to sort of end on a positive note. But that's a great question, and I will follow up with you all about that. Thank you.
Okay, Cindy. Cindy, you're next.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. Just a comment. I'm almost ashamed to say a retired federal employee. I left early because I got sick of it. Was with the Navy Department, and I worked with different agencies. And one of the programs I was quite familiar with was OMB Circular A76. And this was a policy, OMB is, of course, Office of Management and Budget. And it was about contracting out government functions. And for example, on a Navy base, pretty much the maintenance, things like that, you would do studies, cost benefit, to see if you could contract them out. Most, of course, as a government employee, I didn't like it, and I had to do some work with it. Government employees didn't like it. But in all of the years I worked, was familiar with this, there were 3 inherent government functions: collection of revenue, think of IRS, interstate crime, think of FBI, and the military defense of the nation. Well, when I started hearing about Blackwater and all these private security firms in Iraq, it's like, wait a minute, what about this inherent government function? So I pulled up the latest iteration of OMB A76, and all it says is, and it was May 2003, excuse me, which is about the time W. Bush had his Great Mission Accomplished extravaganza. And there's just one little line that says, inherent government functions shall remain with the government, and it doesn't spell any of them out. And if that doesn't clinch it, what you said, this is like a cancer that has metastasized so thoroughly that it's beyond the realm of, I think, maybe everybody but your Christian's comprehension.
but I do kind of get it. And I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for pointing out the OMB circular. I want to, I will look that up and, you know, sort of add it to what I'm trying to do here. I will say that, you know, it's worse than any of us, you know, can imagine. I try to wrap my head around this. And every month I take all of the contracts and I distill them on my website and put them into a one document so that we can see sort of, you know, the nature of the beast. And I will say, just following this stuff for 7 years and looking at these contracts, even during that time period, you can see more and more of government being corporatized, more and more of the War Department being corporatized. And you see one of the trends lately is consultancy firms really taking a huge chunk out of the Pentagon. You'll see really like inherently governmental function, such as policy, now in the hands of war corporations. You will see it written in the contract announcement that, you know, Corporation A, Evil Corporation, Acme Corporation, whatever, is part of their duties are to either carry out what the generals and admirals should be doing, or it'll say, you know, advising on policy, creating policy, and it's right there in black and white. So it's really there's nothing left. And the like you talked about, the real bane of this whole thing is now we've reached up a size and a breadth wherein the beast is so rife and packed with war corporations that it becomes a self-justifying entity. It's just so bloated, and the whole thing justifies its own you know, existence. And that's the problem that we have now. It's just this giant monster that will just perpetuate itself. So, you know, the big you know, snowball turning into a massive down the hill, and you know, there's so yeah, it's quite daunting. And
Okay, Marjorie, if you will unmute yourself and go
Yep.
ahead.
Yes, thank you. Well, I wanted to pick up with what Cynthia was talking about, because that was the area that I wanted to ask you about. When you referred to neoliberalism, before I do that, I just want to thank the organizers, and I want to thank you, Christian. I can't necessarily say I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm not sure that's the right term to use, but I certainly will be edified by it. And what you've done, I think, is a tremendous service in pulling all this massive amount of information together. And I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about your point having to do with the intrusion of neoliberal policy. And I think Cynthia was really pointing out exactly the nuts and bolts of how that's unfolding. But if you could elaborate a little bit on the historical roots. I mean, was this something during the Clinton period that started to take hold, or earlier? I would appreciate that. Thank you.
no, great question. So I should probably define what I mean by neoliberal economic policy first, and then I can go into sort of the history of the whole thing. Neoliberal economics involves privatizing much of government and deregulating big corporations, allowing them to dominate society more and more. It reduces federal spending on programs of social uplift, like healthcare, you know, retirement pensions, whatever. And politicians who embrace neoliberal economics regularly advocate for austerity for the masses and invite corporations into the government. There's a real news network based out of Baltimore, and they define it as the ideological result of the liberal abandonment of humanistic ideals in favor of market-based solutions. And I thought that's also a really good one. It's basically letting the corporations come into what should be public space, including government space, and making everything, commodifying everything, making everything private, turning it, everything they can, every space they can, into profit. So I would say that, yes, it accelerated during the Clinton administration, but it did not get going during the Clinton administration. There's actually a great essay out there called "Supporting the Troops: A History of Military Contracting in the United States." excuse me, and it was written by Martha Elizabeth Fexbell. Yes, it accelerated during the most recent presidencies, but it really kicked off during the Vietnam War, very slowly, sort of. It was a gradual thing, and it really started firing during the Reagan administration, and then every successive administration after that amped it up, and regardless of Democrat, regardless of Republican, doesn't matter party affiliation. They are both two corporate parties, and they defer to corporate realm on nearly all matters. And so what we have today is the result of just decades and decades of these types of policies, and it's a real nightmare. So did I answer your question? I hope I.
Yeah, you did. You did very well. Thank you.
All right, we have actually another question which might have been answered already. Joshua Shepard, you have a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it, or do you think it's been answered, or I can read it if you like.
I'll go ahead and ask.
Right.
I am interested in your favorite examples of wins, like whereas one of the big six or a conglomerate may have had to rescind a big deal due to public opposition.
Are you talking about rescind a big deal as in a contract, as in they were
Right.
contracting, or in the case of Asheville where the corporation was coming into the town and they had to stop that?
I guess more in the contracting vein.
Well, I will tell you that, so I take the position that the military-industrial-congressional complex is an insulated authority. And I say that because while I remain optimistic, the general public does not have any real say in the MIC. We don't have a direct say in what happens in the military decision-making, in the hierarchy. We don't have a direct say in the war industry. Obviously, it's the corporate realm. It is completely opaque, and it's running the show functionally. But we should have some say in Congress because we elect those officials. And we should have some say in the White House because we elect those officials. Unfortunately, they are invariably and almost immediately corrupted by lobbying and campaign finance and other ways that the war industry stacks the deck, including putting its tentacles out across congressional districts in the form of factories and facilities, so then they can play the jobs card. Now, the jobs card is always inflated, but it works very, very well as a complementary tactic to lobbying and congressional finance. They say, I know, we got this factory, we're either bringing it to your town or we've already brought it to your town, that's 800 jobs. The jobs figures are always inflated, but it works really, really well. Now, I'm not going to be able to answer your question right now directly, but I can give this information to Ken if I come across an example of public outrage leading to a canceled contract. But I will say that there is a great tendency these days within the contracts to have products that stink. They don't function as advertised. And this is a feature of the system. So the most famous example is the F-35, right? They said, hey, we'll give you this plane, we'll be able to do everything, and it can't do anything. It's very, very mediocre. It can't fly in lightning storms, or even if there's a threat of lightning around. It costs an arm and a leg. It shot itself the other day. There was an example, and they covered this on the website Task and Purpose, which is sort of a military-oriented website where one of the rotary cannons in the front basically exploded and it damaged its own jet. So these products are horrible. They don't complete the task that they market themselves as being able to complete. And the reason this happens is because back in the day, say during the Vietnam War, if you were a war corporation and you were pitching a good or a service, a major good or a service, like a new aircraft, you had to have a functioning prototype that could do everything, and then the generals would sign off on it, or the high-ranking civilians as well, and the Pentagon would sign off on it. Nowadays, you you don't have that. That requirement is essentially null and void, and they don't enforce that at all because the war industry is now functionally in charge. So you can say, hey, you know, we got this aircraft. We'll do everything. You sign it off, and we'll build it as we go through the contracting process. So you have, it's not just the F-35. You have the KC-46, which is a Boeing air-to-air refueling. It's called a tanker. It basically refuels aircraft in flight. Traditionally, you had a boom operator in the back trying to fit the refueling boom into the recipient aircraft. And what they did was Boeing promised the world, and they said, hey, you know, you don't need to have a boom operator in the back. What we'll do is we'll have a video feed, and that will work just as well. Of course, the video feed doesn't work. The aircraft has debris in it. One of the fuel lines has been known to leak. And so the aircraft stinks, but it's billions and billions of dollars. And you get this with the Littoral Combat Ship, the Zumwalt class. You get it with the new aircraft carriers that they're building. General Atomics, aside from building drones, is now building the launching and the arresting device that goes on these new aircraft carriers. Now, traditionally, this was steam powered. But General Atomics says, hey, you know what? We'll make it electromagnetic. It'll be wonderful. Just give us a couple $2 billion. So they gave him a couple $2 billion, and the thing doesn't work. It breaks down. I think you need well over, I don't know, several hundred cycles, which is the Pentagon standard before you break down. You say, all right, we need to be able to cycle this through many, many times so that we can launch aircraft and arrest them. And then, you have to, you're not allowed to break down very often. Well, they haven't even reached, 1/10 of that marker. So it is a part of my French. It's a piss poor system. Now, I bring this up because there's optimism here. The war industry is defeating itself, and if we can raise these examples and understand these examples and put these in the public domain, we can further try to influence the political process. If not at the federal level, then at the state and local level. We can say, hey, these war corporations that claim to, they invoke the troops all the time, they claim to provide solutions for government problems, yada, yada, yada. Oh, they're not even doing that. They can't even make a plane that flies. They can't make a refueler that refuels. They can't make an aircraft carrier that launches aircraft. So I would say that's a reason to be optimistic. It's maybe a twisted reason to be optimistic. And I didn't really answer your question, but I will say that there's, there's a little bit of positivity there. So thank you.
Okay, we have a question that was submitted through Veterans for Peace. They're streaming this as well, and somebody on their Twitch channel posed a question for you. So you might have answered this one already. You can decide. The question is, how many of these war industry companies have influence over the government, that is, paying off politicians and lobbyists?
Great question. So the big six, the answer is the big six. I mean, they all try to influence government. But if you look at, you can go to Open Secrets, I believe it's .org, and see sort of the itemized breakdown of who's influencing whom when it comes to lobbying and campaign finance. The big six do the vast majority of the bribery, which is campaign finance, or the lobbying, which is, face-to-face. Hey, sit down with us. We'll buy you a 3-martini lunch, and we'll explain to you how we want the bill written, and you guys will write the bill as we want, you, the elected officials. So yeah, it's really the big six. After that, there's a huge drop-off. And that depends on location sometimes. So for example, in Eastern Virginia, where the Navy has a huge presence, Huntington Ingalls, which is a top 10, top 15 war corporation, will try to sway those federal politicians that come from there, whether it's the senators or the representatives. But by and large, it's Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, L3Harris. And this is an important point to make. Wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign war corporations are allowed to also corrupt the US political process. So BAE Systems, its most productive plants in terms of actual output and profit, are located in the United States. It's a UK war corporation. Their most productive plants are in the US. So the wholly owned subsidiaries are allowed to donate and corrupt the US political process. No problem. It doesn't matter that the parent company is a UK corporation. So that's bizarre, and it should be illegal in any functioning democracy, but we're not a functioning democracy, and many can make the argument that we're not a democracy. Same thing with Elbit Systems. It's an apartheid Israel war corporation. They have substantial presence in Maryland, substantial presence in Fort Worth, Texas, and they are allowed, because it is a US-based subsidiary, to influence the US political process. So that that part doesn't answer your question, but it is important to highlight.
All right, that's it for the questions, Christian. If you want to give us your conclusion here.
So thank you for your time. Thank you all. I really sincerely appreciate this. You are a great group. You're very patient, and sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I will just conclude by stating some reasons to be optimistic. You know, every day, we're doom scrolling, we're reading the news, and it's a tough go these days on planet Earth. But there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic. The ruling class will try to return to business as usual, and they have tried to do that during the pandemic. They will try to do it after the pandemic. They will continue to try to profit off of the capitalist system that they create and benefit from. No matter what happens, though, the status quo is a goner. There are simply too many pressures on the system. Capitalism demands infinite growth. Corporations will continue to come into communities, raise the trees, erect facilities to build new products, from which to profit or through which to profit. Communities will continue to suffer. You can defeat a single facility in the short term. You can. In the long term, war corporations will try to regroup and establish facilities elsewhere. So the main goal is to build a new society in which profit over people is not the guiding force. A society perhaps in which the workers, not a few executives, control the facilities, control the machinery, control the means of production. So the system's byproducts that are overwhelming the system include food deserts, homelessness, consumerism, the wealth gap, no universal health care, pandemics that the world's richest nation can't cope with, commodification of life, pollution in the air, in the water, in the soil, neglected infrastructure, including the power grid, which we saw in Texas recently, but we've seen in the Northeast. There was a blackout in the Northeast, I think in the early 2000s. Refugees, sixth mass extinction, unemployment, gig economy. Yeah, these are horrible, and we are facing them, and they are very difficult. But the or inability to respond to these problems can be seen as an opportunity. Where they don't respond, we can respond. So you can respond via reform. Some people advocate reform. That means getting legislation passed, perhaps saying, hey, corporations are not people. Let's get money out of politics. Let's overturn Citizens United, which was passed, I think, in 2010. Abolish the Electoral College. Implement a Green New Deal of some sort. Take back the radio spectrum. Once the radio spectrum belonged to the people, now it is completely, entirely in corporate hands, headquartered miles and miles away, perhaps in New York City, perhaps in LA. Other reform can involve addressing each side of the MIC. So to address the military, you run counter-recruitment campaigns in your hometown. Say, hey, if you are thinking of going into the military, here are the reasons why you shouldn't. And if you absolutely must go into the military, here are the career fields that you should go into. So you get a trade, so you can get education, so you can get the GI Bill, so you can get out, and you can benefit from this thing. There are divestment campaigns that municipalities across the US, including in Rhode Island, right here, are trying to get passed that will divest local, for example, maybe state pension funds out of the war industry. One of the encouraging things, you can go to worldbeyondwar.org/divest and see examples, successful examples of this. Norway, I believe, doesn't invest in most war corporations. You can name and shame the corrupt politicians to the extent that that works. You can run progressive candidates against war industry's favorites. These are all examples of reform. The other option would be to discard the whole system, discard the old system and build a new. This will involve workers' cooperatives, wherein the workers make the decisions. The workers own and operate the machinery, the factories, the facilities. The workers are in charge. You don't need a suit thousands of miles away to make the decisions. This is nonsense. This is what we've all been raised to believe, but they care about profit. They care about pleasing Wall Street. They do not care about you. They do not care about your local community. They do not care about pollution. They want they care about the almighty dollar, or whatever currency it is. Discarding the system involves planting food, understanding how seeds work, understanding how life works. And more people, the reason I'm optimistic is more and more people are getting into this stuff. They are growing their own food, even if it's just if you live in a city and you just have people are shunning advertising. They're turning this media. They're trying to understand where things come from. What are your supply lines? What are the vulnerabilities of the supply lines, of the roads, rail, on the ports? And this is not to say that you should launch some offensive. This is to say to understand where things come from and how to work and act locally. There was a meme that was going around recently that said grandma survived the Great Depression because her supply chain was local and she knew how to do stuff. And I think that that's incredibly important for us to think about, because the future is local, and the future is great communities like you down there in Asheville, and or up in Eastern Massachusetts with Mass Peace Action. So I'll leave you with some advice, and it might seem cliche, but it's important to think about. There was a Chinese military strategist, a general in the 5th century BC. His name was Sun Tzu. I'm sure you've all heard of him. He talked about violence a lot, which I am not talking about. I am not condoning. His wisdom to strategy, to protest, to mass movements. And so I'll just give some tips that I've come across, and I think that can apply to any organization that is trying to push back against the war machine. So press the capitalists where they are weak. Don't press wrong. Identify their weaknesses and press them there. Know your enemy well. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What's their corporate strategy? Who are the corporate officers? We in the United States, we might know everyone who plays for the nearest professional baseball team or professional NBA team. All right, but why don't we know the war corporations? Who's the CFO? Who's the CEO? Who's on the board of directors? We need to know this stuff. They're literally physically our oppressors. So know them. Create Google alerts for elites within the MIC. Who's running the military? Where do they go? Follow them after their careers in the military and are done. Where they pull their government stipend, and on top of that, they go work for a war corporation? Who are the civilians who come from the war corporations to work within the Pentagon civilian offices? Not just at the secretary level, which we've seen a lot in recent years, but also at the sundry undersecretary and deputy undersecretary levels. You, the people, we the people, are agile. We're creative. The war machine is bureaucratic. It is bloated. Know the terrain. Who knows the area better? You or some corporate spokesperson? How can you leverage that? Don't show all your cards. This one is pretty important. Don't show all your cards, your allies. Organize face-to-face. If you're organizing across a capitalist product or a tool, especially if it comes out of Silicon Valley, you are it might be get in the habit to organize face-to-face. No side. Another good news, excellent good news, is that no side of the MIC can do anything without the working class. You win the working class, you win the conflict. You really do. Befriend the workers at the plant. Even worst case scenario, Raytheon moves into Asheville, makes the plant. All right, it stinks. We lost that round. But guess what? What are they thinking? And win the working class, and slowly learn from them, and they can learn from you, and you can start to understanding the nature of the beast at the local level. And who knows, maybe the workers can make some moves. Deception. When you're weak, show that you're strong. When you're strong, drop hints that you're weak. And I'll just end with courage is contagious. It really is. It really is contagious. And more and more people are caring for one another. Random act of kindness within, whether it's in Asheville, or the Eastern Seaboard. Unconditional love. These are incredibly important as we go about our day. Whether it's a smile or a kind word, you really can make a difference out there in the world. You really can put out positivity and good ripples. And yeah, thank you all for your time. I sincerely appreciate this. And yeah, I will stay in touch with you all, and I'll stay in touch with Ken. And if you have any further questions, my website is www.warindustrymuster.com. You can reach out to me there in the contact. And yeah, best of luck. I'm happy to come back at any time and do this again. So thank you all.
All right. Thank you so much, Christian. That was so good. Let me make a plug for you. If you haven't seen his book, this is it, and it's not hard to read, and it is, it's full of information that he, as you can tell, that he put in there. So that's the plug for the book, and the website I put in the chat as well. If you want to scroll up and find that, the link is there. Two other plugs. One is for Reject Raytheon. If you're local, or even if you're not local and you want to be part of our work, we have a website, and it's Reject Raytheon AVL. Just go there and you can see what we're up to. You can join us. You can click a button and get on our email list. You can donate. And anyway, so it has our other site, our other Twitter and Instagram clicks there as well. And lastly, if you don't know, many of you probably do know already about Mass Peace Action. They are a prime organization of activism. And we're so happy to have them as co-sponsors of this and as partners of our work. I mean, they've been at this for a while. We're new at this. And so get on their mailing list, look at their website. They have a YouTube channel, which is great. They're working it all the time. So that's it. So thanks everybody. This went longer than we thought it might, but you didn't lose my interest, Christian. It was so good. All right, so let's call it an evening, and
Thank
take
you
care. Peace and justice and sustainability.
Thank you very much for an excellent program.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Have a wonderful evening, y'all.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.